Hero selection has been a feature in the Empire at War Expanded Thrawn's Revenge mod for a long time, letting you pick which time period you start in and which Imperial leader you start with. But ever since the Conference of Creepy Old Men was added as an alternative regime to Isard, the question has been, why can't we start as them? Today's video was the story of how why can't we start as them got answered with yes, grammatically incorrect as that answer may be. Basically, the idea here is to add a pop-up option during the Conquest loading phase to allow you to select which regime you want to start with, whether it's Isard or the Central Committee of Grand Moffs. This is similar to how the Lambda Sector Galactic Conquest works, where you choose two different options for the Empire, but it's a bit more complex to do since there's a bunch of other conditions floating around for how the progressive campaigns load. To start though, we first need to change the conditions on which the game will go to a specific regime when loading, which is part of a long list of checks essentially comparing one value, currently era, against the target. Right now it basically checks the era the player has selected and then changes the regime to match that era. First we need to make a change so that there is a new thing to check. Specifically, we can now check the regime that has been selected and have that be a separate thing from the era that's been selected. I did make a mistake when doing this though. The way I have these lines set up now, it'll never actually think it needs to change, which I'll realize in a few minutes. It's basically set to always think it's in the correct regime right now. Rather than just shoving in the Central Committee as regime index number 3 and pushing everything else further down the line, I want to add a separate indicator to this, basically making it a sub-regime of regime 2. So since this is a second version of regime 2, I'm labeling it as regime 22. This method may need to change later depending on how we end up using the regime indices in different places, but it should work for what we want to do right now. We would have the option, for example, to change this into a decimal maybe, or to change it from numbers to names, but that's a problem for later. It wouldn't change how we're setting this up right now, it'd just change the numbers that get entered, so we don't want to get too distracted from our main goal here. We also need to create a new dummy object, this Central Committee dummy, which we'll be placing on the map to tell the framework this map is intended to start as the Central Committee. If the game finds that object on the map, it knows to go to the Central Committee regime, and then it gets rid of the dummy object. This check goes on top of all the other checks for era, and then only executes if you're starting in the second era. So basically it gets onto the map, it checks what era it's supposed to be by looking for the usual era dummy, and then it'll check if it's an era 2 as the Empire for this specific dummy to tell it whether it should change to the Central Committee. With all that done, it's time for the first test. I hadn't broken absolutely everything, which is a good sign, but I had broken the era checks, which is bad, since I'd been trying to start in the Thrawn era. I pretty quickly realized I'd broken the functions doing the comparisons to see if the era needed to change, since it was basically set to check against itself, as I mentioned earlier. After fixing that, it worked and I could select the regimes like normal. It's hard to overstate just how much time in this process is spent waiting for the game to load, checking one value, exiting out of the game, and then repeating. You guys get to skip the loading screens, but while I'm trying to include my mistakes in this process, I'm also trying to spare you the boredom of hearing me say, then I loaded it, shut it down, change one more thing, and start it again. So just assume anytime you're seeing an in-game test, you're not seeing about 5 others trying to check for the same thing. The next step, before we set up the actual selection process, is making sure we can load into the Central Committee regime at all. We can test that by setting the code to assume we have it selected, and then this is what our eventual mechanism to do the selection is going to alter. Fortunately, that worked on the first try, so we can move on to setting up the proper check here. This script we're in is the setup which happens once you're already on the map. It's what initializes the framework, which controls all the mod's features, so it's always going to be involved after the player has already made their choice, which will be in a separate campaign loader. Basically, when you're playing one of these progressive maps, the way it works is you are on the main campaign menu, you select which conquest you want to be in the area you're in, that loads a fake galactic conquest which takes some of that information and uses it to tell the game which map to load that you actually want to be on, which is how all the different eras are able to have different planet layouts. So with this script, we only need to check for the extra object, which will set the selected regime to 22 if our dummy is found. We then need to duplicate the Era 2 campaigns in all of the progressive maps and add the version with the dummy. This is less than ideal since it means duplicating and doing manual work to distinguish the actual maps for Isard and the committee, but because we can't pass information from the loading campaign into the real campaign, we do have to do this extra setup right now. But with all those dummies added to the map, we can move on to editing the scripts in the fake Galactic Conquest, which just acts as the loading environment. This basically takes the name of the map you want to load, represented with a planet with the map's name, and then adds the era you want to start in, which is taken from the option screen using the relabeled credit selection, and adds the faction's name to that string. All of these are added together to build the name of the new campaign you want to load. So we need a check which takes that if it's any campaign ending with 2_Empire, for example known galaxy small era 2 Empire, to put up a pop-up option menu, allowing for the player to choose between ISARD and the committee. And if they choose the committee, then we add _CCOGM to the name of our new map set. That name is then what's used by the load campaign event, which puts you into the new map. Incredibly hacky, but it's what you have to do to have something like this work, so I prefer to call it creative. Right now, we're just going to assume any Era 2 selection is the central committee. I made another mistake here since the object name it's pulling from will always be capitalized, and it's case sensitive, so once I went in game, realized it was broken, exited and swapped that, I went back in game and it worked, having only cost me 5 minutes of my life for not capitalizing it in the first place. Next to loading screens, the thing that will by far cost you the most time while modding is not having the correct capitalization on case-sensitive things. But with that all finally working, we can get to the fun part, adding the actual pop-up menu. This will look a bit confusing while it all rushes through and I copy the relevant parts from other places we use it, especially the Lambda Sector campaign, but part of that is because I hadn't worked with this directly before, so I was still learning how it all went together, and I'll explain what it all means in a second. The most important part is that the functions we're going to be using require something called crossplot, a script developed by Smallpox which allows you to pass information and triggers between different scripts, and then we can use those functions to use the pop-up generic event created by Phil, which allows us to put up a custom menu wherever we want it using the assassination function of the game. So the menu you're using when you make these selections is actually the same menu that comes up when you try to assassinate a hero in the base game. The way the pop-up basically works is it spawns all of those assassinatable objects, then it spawns an assassin and triggers their ability, and then the menu comes up allowing the player to pick one of the options. The death event of the option you pick is then able to be picked up by our other scripts, and we can use that to interpret what the player wants to happen. Originally, the campaign loading script just went through some preset functions and did the same thing every time based on information it already had before, but now it needs to prompt something for player input, and it needs to wait while some of this is happening. In particular, it needs to know when the answer has come on what the player chose, and that comes from a different script, which is why we need crossplot. All of that scrolling, typing, and pasting accomplished a few main things. First, the crossplot script was added to the set of other scripts that this script is able to run within itself, giving it access to all the crossplot functions. Then at the top, we initialize crossplot, and we tell it to listen for a choice being made on the pop-up, which is given a specific name tag so that it knows which pop-up it's listening for. Once this particular crossplot event has an update, it'll know to go to the next function. Our second area of changes comes in when it does the check for whether you're in Era 2 as the Empire, which we had just set up a couple minutes ago. If not, then none of this is relevant, and it'll just go straight into the load GC function, checking the planet names, the faction you're playing, and the era that was selected before like normal. But if so, it makes that new option menu with two options, either ISARD or the committee. It waits for the input, and once it has it, it goes into the load GC function, but with some added information. If it sees that variable, the choice variable, actually has a value, specifically if it's the central committee option, it will append _CCOGM to what it's trying to load. ISARD is treated as the default, so if ISARD is chosen, it doesn't actually have to do anything with the menu input. All it's doing in that case is using the trigger from the option being chosen to go into the final function. But simply putting in those names isn't enough. We need to make the actual option buttons and header information, all of which are their own dummy XML objects. I'm copying the Lambda setup with a header, a body, and two options since we're doing the same thing. But after that failed in testing, I had to make one further significant change to our code. Crossplot communicates between scripts, so if we're telling a script that hasn't actually started yet to do something, it can't actually do it. We'd basically been telling the plugin, which runs the pop-ups, to do something before that plugin had been started. So this code where we're telling it to bring up the pop-up menu has to be delayed a bit. It got moved to a different event trigger called initialize, which is prompted to run by a story event a few seconds later, allowing the other scripts to get up and running. Aside from that, everything else is basically the same. Unfortunately, that still wasn't working, and I couldn't tell why. It was never actually launching the pop-up despite the time passing. After messing around on my own a bit, I had to ask Jorrit, who had worked with this setup when doing the Lambda campaign and the custom maps for the last release, and he discovered the framework, which runs the pop-up in this case, so the thing that actually handles that menu coming up, was crashing because of the dummy planet objects that I mentioned at the start of the video for the map names. As far as the game and more importantly our framework is concerned, these dummy planets are still just planets. So even though I wasn't using them for regular planety things, I still needed to have them set up the same way that other planets are when you're actually playing the game. Specifically, this meant adding some events which tell the game when a given planet is selected or zoomed in on. This is used by the framework for the display at the top left side of the screen where it'll tell you which planet is selected, and it's also used to help run things like the ship build bar filters. This wasn't needed before because we hadn't needed to run the framework on the fake loading campaign before, but now since we were using some of the functions from the framework, we need everything to work with it. So with that tip from Jorrit and the other events now set up, I went in for one final test and waited for several painful seconds for our results. The pop-up did finally show up, so while there's still some text to do and some other changes to the regime itself, everything is now working as intended. So now I just had to push our changes to the version control software and close the task for it. In point 5, you'll be able to use this and select which of those two regimes you want to start in. Phil coming up with the pop-ups has added a lot of fun potential for things like this, so we're going to continue to insert it where it makes sense, but I hope you've enjoyed this look behind the curtain at how little competency you actually need to get something like this done, as long as you're willing to dig through and see how things actually work. Either way, thank you for watching. I've done one of these videos before, so maybe check that out if you're interested. It'll be the suggested video on the screen right now, and if you do enjoy seeing this kind of thing, let me know in the comments and I'll try to do some more.